大家同事。
Good afternoon. Thank you, members, for coming back to take part in the meeting. Time is up, and we've also formed a quorum, so I'll invite the administration to join us. There's only one item on the agenda, which is about the technical memorandum for allocation of emission allowances for power plants. For members who joined the panel during the last session, I think you will recall it for the TM for allocation of emission allowances. It is a standing issue, and there are always a number of controversial points. I would like to welcome the officials. We have Mr. Andrew Lai, Deputy Director of Environmental Protection, Mr. Mok Wai Chin, Assistant Director Air Policy, and Mr. Dave Ho, Principal Environmental Protection Officer Air Policy. All the three gentlemen are from the EPD. Just now I was trying to explain about the background, but why don't I just give the floor to Mr. Lai? Thank you. Madam Chair, I'd like to thank members for finding time out of your very busy schedule to attend this meeting. As the Chairlady has said, under the Air Pollution Control Ordinance, once every 2 years, the administration will review the emission allowance caps. This is because we've got three major sources of air pollution: power plants, vehicles, and vessels. Therefore, through the TM of the APCO, we try to regulate the emission allowances for power plants. The third TM was submitted to the LegCo for approval. It is almost time, since 2 years have passed, and in accordance with the ordinance, we've carried out a review. The findings have been set out in the paper. Under the APCO, for the three specified pollutants, the power plants will be given emission caps by the administration. When we drew up the draft emission caps, I would like to draw your attention to the following. First of all, for fuel mix, basically, we are basing our assessment on 2015 scenarios. Probably you have heard from the power plants that in order to improve the air pollution problem, since the second TM effective in 2015, they have been asked to increase the ratio of natural gas in the fuel mix, and that would put a pressure on them. Well, in fact, for the third TM as well as the fourth TM that we have proposed, for the fuel mix, it is based on what's going to happen in 2015 as far as the fuel mix is concerned. In other words, for the consultation exercise concerning our future fuel mix started earlier this year, if we are to have a new decision, say for example, should the fuel mix be changed, then it will be factored in next year when we try to draft a new TM so as to regulate the emission caps post-2020. Therefore, as far as the fuel mix is concerned, for the current exercise, it is the status quo. Members may ask as to whether we are getting the possibility of tightening up of the emission caps when compared with what was done 2 years ago. We try to see what is practicable. For the past 2 years, two developments have been looked at. First of all, for the West-East gas pipeline, we got the gas from that source, and then for the sulfur content is lower than that specified in the contract. So we have been looking at the pollutants contained in the actual fuel supply when we drew up the emission caps. We've also noted that the generation of electricity has taken two different directions. For HEC, when compared with the third TM for 2017, it is noted that the generation will drop by 4%. So even if all else remains the same, there is a possibility to tighten up the cap. On the other hand, for the CLP, since more infrastructural projects are concentrated in Kowloon and the New Territories, so when compared with 2017, in the year 2019, there will be an increase of 4% in the amount of the electricity being generated. Therefore, when we look at the possibilities for emission cap adjustments, we've taken into account their respective circumstances. In Annex 1, we have put out the figures for HEC 5 to 20%, for CLP, for the other two pollutants, the caps would be the same. For SO2, a reduction of 4%. The TM will be part of the subsidiary legislation, and therefore we have to make the subsidiary legislation before we can implement the emission caps. In accordance with the APCO, we must give 4 clear years' notice to the power plants before the new emission allowances can come into effect. In other words, in 2019, if we would like to implement the lowered emission caps on the 1st of January, in other words, the latest would be the 1st of January 2015 that we promulgate the new emission caps. In other words, before the end of December, we hope the LC will give approval. Now, our timetable is that we hope that towards the end of this month, we can introduce the TM's subsidiary legislation to the LegCo. But of course, if LegCo members have further questions or comments, I'm sure you can form a subcommittee to scrutinize the subsidiary legislation containing the TM. Well, I think we want to take this opportunity to come to you at the very first opportunity to introduce the suggestions to you. Before I open the floor to your questions, I would like to explain that it is a piece of subsidiary legislation by way of negative vetting. In other words, once it has been gazetted, of course the LegCo may veto it altogether, but that means that we have to start afresh. So if you would like to make any suggestions for any changes, please try to do so before the Gazette. Otherwise, it will be impossible for us to beat the deadline so as to make sure that there are two power plans to comply with the new caps for 2019. Mr. Lai, in the past I used to argue with you over one particular point. Mr. Kam Lai Wai of the Democratic Party asked for a review once every 2 years. Would you like to explain about this point? Or maybe Mr. Moore is more familiar with the point. Madam Chair, I think probably way back when we had the first TM, we said that the TMs will be reviewed once every 3 years. And then when the LegCo scrutinized the second TM, during meetings of your subcommittee, there was a revision. There is once every 2 years, we will be taking a look of our TMs. Now, on this occasion, as Mr. Lai has said, the government is currently undertaking a consultation on the fuel mix in the long term. We anticipate that in 2015, there will be some initial outcome. For the fuel mix in the long term, I think it has a lot to do with the power plant's capacity to meet the emission caps. So we won't be having biannual reviews. Next year, we're going to have a review again in the light of the new fuel mix, so as to look at the emission caps for the period after 2020. 2 members have raised their hands. 4 members would like to ask questions. 4 minutes each. In this order, Wu Jiwai, Liang Kai-cheng, Francis Yik, and Kenneth Chen. Mr. Wu Jiwai. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, in accordance with the paper, for the new emission allowances, I think it is based on the assumption that there won't be any change to the fuel mix. But then the public's understanding is that for the CLP in particular, there will be pressure to increase the tariffs as a result of the new fuel mix. So the paper seems to draw a different picture from what we have been given to understand from the CLP. The CLP has been saying that it will exert a lot of pressure on them in relation to the tariff. The second point is about mathematics. Now, for the Kowloon region, there will be an increase in demand for electricity by 4%. But you have said that there's room for downward adjustments. This is because for the West-East Gas Pipeline 2 exercise, you found that the natural gas delivered contains less sulfur than the limit prescribed in the supply contract. What about the quality of the natural gas? Will it remain the same or will it be subject to changes? Should there be a change, how are you going to deal with the problem? Because it may exert some pressure on the tariff. And then lastly, a simple question. Can you, in great details, explain to us what has to be done to the generation units so as to achieve the emission allowances? Because what you have told us is rather general. Mr. Lai, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wu, for your three questions. All of them are interrelated. First of all, the fuel mix and possible changes. What we are proposing to the electrical is the fourth TM. It will come into effect in 2019. For the previous two, for the second one, it will come into effect in 2015, the third one in 2017. I have to give you the dates because Mr. Wu and other members would probably recall that for the power plants, in relation to the second TM made in 2012, in relation to the emission caps, power plants were more concerned. Currently, on average, the two power companies are relying on natural gas for 20 to 30% of their fuel mix. When the TM was made in 2012, the administration asked the two power plants to raise the ratio of natural gas in relation to the fuel mix up to almost 50%. And therefore, the power companies, as far as the fuel mix and the relationship with the tariff, well, there was more an issue when we discussed the second TM 2 years ago. This is because starting from 2015, power companies have to use natural gas to account for 50% of the generation.
The second TM was made in 2010, and the third TM was made 2 years ago, and it was on the basis of 50% of the fuel will be natural gas. So on the basis that the fuel mix would remain more or less the same, we're using the second TM, which would take effect in 2015. And the third TM made 2 years ago, and also the coming TM would not ask for a greater proportion of natural gas to be used. Without increasing the percentage of natural gas, how is it possible to lower emission? Please refer to para 9. And it talks about the reduction in power generation by HEC by 4%. And for CLP, there will be growth in generation, and therefore we cannot cut the allowances to such a great extent. And then the West East Gas Pipe 2 contains less sulfur than the limit prescribed in the contract, and that's second consideration. And the two power companies have also installed reduction devices. The reduction efficiency turns out to be higher than the design level. So we've been aggressive. We are using the actual performance to set the new allowances. So even though there won't be a major change in the fuel mix, we can set stricter emission allowances for the power companies. For the two companies, they have not adjust their fuel mix. They're able to cut their emission allowances, and the two power companies find this very challenging and onerous. So they have to do things to achieve that. Where possible, they will prioritize the use of gas-fueled generation units. And they also have to enhance the maintenance and repair of their emission control devices so as to meet the new standards. I think Mr. Wu raised a very good issue. Should there be unpredictable events such as an extremely long summer where the use of air conditioning is higher than anticipated, and it is impossible for us to require the power companies to cap the power generation. So if there are unforeseen factors, then under Section 26G, we can allow the director of EP to adjust the emission allowances. Mr. Lai, while you are an official, I won't stop you from speaking, but please be succinct and please do not give too many examples. I allowed you to go on for 5 minutes because Mr. Wu spent less than 1 minute to ask you a very specific question. So are you done with your examples? Please be more succinct. Well, if members have further queries, I will use other examples to illustrate. Yes, please do so. Mr. Kenneth Leung, I'd like to seek some background information. You have sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and RSP. I'd like to know whether they are accepted international standards. And why don't we have any emission allowance for carbon dioxide? Because we have to consider the role of carbon dioxide in climatic change. And you've also got this TM with power companies. I'd like to know, is there any obligation on the government to provide information or assistance to power companies to help them to achieve the emission allowances? And if they fail to achieve these allowances, do you have any power to take enforcement action? Recently, I visited a power company in Germany. They use green coal. I don't know whether the two power companies here are using that, because according to the company, green coal is not really coal. It is just a green coal made of recycled organic waste. And the company is mixing green coal with ordinary coal, and the CO2 emission will be lower than 30%. It's only a 30% of CO2 emission by ordinary coal. I'd like to know whether you have discussed this with the two power companies. Thank you. Under the CAPO or APCO, well, we are the enforcement department, so we do care about emissions. we have real-time monitoring of the hourly emission of power companies. So our monitoring is very meticulous. It is the responsibility of the power companies to meet these targets, and I think the power companies are procuring low sulfur coal from Indonesia. But of course, we can discuss with the power companies in relation to the technology you mentioned to see whether it is feasible in their generation units. Regarding the emission of carbon dioxide and other pollutants, perhaps my colleague, Mr. Mock, can supplement. Thank you. Regarding the use of green coal, Mr. Leung is talking about the mixing of municipal waste with traditional coal. It is called green coal because of CO2 emission consideration. Many places feel that turning waste to energy is a kind of renewable energy. In our TM, we have a part on renewable energy, RE, and I can talk about this later. First, our control is mainly on SO2, NO2, and RSP. Are they international standards? The answer is yes, because internationally people mainly regulate power company emission through these three pollutants. And under the ordinance, we are given the power to set emission allowances for these three pollutants. Why have we not included carbon dioxide? Because so far there is no way to recycle carbon dioxide into other materials or substances. So how do we deal with carbon dioxide? We use a higher proportion of natural gas to lower the emission of carbon dioxide, which is greenhouse gas. Can you give me one more minute? Madam Chair, I have one follow-up question. May I? I'm not talking about the recycling or recovering of CO2, but I want you to add CO2. I want you to add an allowance for CO2 in your TM. You cannot allow it to increase from, say, 2,000 to 5,000 tons next year, because we don't know how the power companies are performing in terms of carbon dioxide emission. Madam Chair, we are acting in accordance with the power granted to us under APCO. So we are not empowered by the ordinance to set an emission allowance for carbon dioxide. Mr. Leung may ask, why don't we amend the legislation? It is because there is no control technology for carbon dioxide. There is no developed economy that has got an emission allowance for carbon dioxide. So if we are to lower carbon dioxide emission, one solution is to increase the use of natural gas. Of course, the use of natural gas has other advantages. The emission of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and RSP would also be lower. What I mean to say is, if we don't have the technology, then it is meaningless to have an emission allowance. By the same token, other advanced economies do not have any emission allowance for carbon dioxide. Now, if so long as your questions are specific and not for expression of opinion, I will be lenient. Mr. Yik, I think the trend is for the emission allowances to be tighter and tighter. But as I've said before, environmental protection comes with a price. So you are going to tighten the emission caps. This has led to substantial increase in electricity tariff in recent years. So while you further tighten emission caps in the future, will you consider the consumers' affordability as well? According to your paper, the two power companies have no strong views about your proposed emission caps, and there is no need for tariff adjustment, but there is no ruling out a tariff adjustment should there be further tightening. So in your paper, I hope you can give us an assessment of affordability or impact on the public's affordability as a result of the new caps. Thank you. Under Section 26G of APCO, the emission caps of power companies are to be fixed by the Director of Environmental Protection. And under Section 26D, the Director has to consider three factors in fixing the caps. First, there must be he must have regard to the best practicable means, and secondly, he should have as purpose the attainment and maintenance of any relevant air quality objective, and he must have regard to whether the emission of that type of pollutant would be or be likely to be prejudicial to health. So the Director or the Secretary will consider these three factors. Well, in other words, you do not consider the public's affordability. It is not among your considerations, right? Yeah, this is not listed in the ordinance. And Mr. Yik is very concerned about the impact on tariff. In this exercise, as I said right from the beginning, it will depend on the, it is based on the new fuel mix for the power companies in 2015. So we so it's rather unlikely that the new caps will put pressure on the power companies. But to be fair to the two power companies, they have found the new emission caps very challenging and difficult. So they're saying that should there be unforeseeable factors beyond their control, for instance, if not able to procure low sulfur coal, or if there are other unforeseen events, they would like us to take that into account. Thank you. I understand. For the current TM, there may not be major impacts, and they have accepted your proposal.
I understand that they're worried that the emission caps would get tighter and tighter. I want to know which countries are being adopted as the benchmarks. I think we are quite advanced and progressive in terms of the emission caps. I, of course, didn't take part in the formulation of the policy in the first place, but I found it very odd that the three factors do not include any consideration of public affordability. If we are to make major changes to the emission allowances, the most effective way is to adjust the fuel mix policy. I should know that early this year, the administration has carried out a consultation exercise on the fuel mix policy in the long term. So tariff, environmental concerns, public affordability have all been included. Therefore, when we draw up the policy of fuel mix in the long term, environmental protection and consumers' affordability will certainly be taken into account. So within the context, such factors will be considered. Well, I think you can lower the guaranteed rate of return to ease the pressure on tariffs. They don't have to make 9.99% as the rate of return. Kenneth Chen. Well, I understand that the Director of the Director Bureau for the Education of the Environment Bureau will look at the factors and come up with the TM. You would also look at the air quality objectives? Yes. I just want to remind colleagues and officials that after the relevant ordinance has come into effect for 5 years, then we have to review the AQOs again. So that would mean 2019. And in other words, we would be having better air qualities as a result of the tighter AQO requirements. Now for this TM, it is going to become effective in 2019. So how are the two to be dovetailed? If we are to tighten up the AQOs, what about the fourth TM? Irrespective of the findings of the review, it appears to me that it won't have an impact on the fourth TM because the fourth TM would have been made 4 years in advance. Even if we try very hard to improve the AQOs, the new AQOs will have no bearing on the fourth TM. Am I right? They are related. For the fourth TM, we say that starting from 2019, for the emission caps for the 2 power plants, we would like to tighten them. With your approval, I'm sure they will go a long way towards meeting the new AQOs for 2020. But then it would not be the only measure. And that's why earlier this year we have started a consultation exercise on the fuel mix policy for the long term. It is more than just an energy policy. It is also related to whether we can meet the new AQOs post-2020. Therefore, in this paper, we've said that for our biennial review, we have already done what we need to do for 2019, and we've tightened up the caps. Now next year, when we announce the new fuel mix policies, should there be more directives for tighter emission caps, then we will have another TM, and then in 2020 there will be tighter emission caps. All right, so they are sort of going to be interactive. Once something is done, when this is done, together with the findings of the consultation of the fuel mix policy, then we will also have to review the AQOs under the relevant ordinance. All of them will have a positive impact on each other, right? Yes. Madam Chair, I would like to ask one other question. For CLP, across the harbor, now, because of population growth, there will be more power to be generated, but you have tried hard to offset the increase in the emission. So you're not going to reduce the emission, but you're offsetting the increased emission. Can you elaborate on that? Will there be any change or not? Mr. Lai, please take a look at page 4 of the Chinese version, where you have Table 1. Table 1, for COP, for sulfur dioxide, there will be a decrease of 4%, but then for nitrogen oxides and RSP, they will remain the same as that found in the third TM. Thank you, Madam Chair. For me, I've also got a question about the tariff as well as the fuel mix policy. Emission caps are, of course, posing a challenge to the power companies when they are tightened up. I think our generation units are very advanced. Now, if the fuel mix remains the same, there will be a certain degree of difficulty. For the natural gas, there is a new contract, but then the price is more expensive than before. Now, I understand that we have got diversity in the supply of natural gas. Say, for example, liquefied natural gas, but then we need to have a new terminal to be built for loading and unloading as well as storage. Now, for the new contract, the prices are more expensive. I just wonder if we can diversify the source of supply so that natural gas can come at a lower price. And in fact, we are not opposing the work of the businessman. We want to be both green to the environment. We also want to allow the businessman to make profits. So I don't think we should just have a limited source of supply, namely from West-East gas pipeline. And then we need to have energy conservation. This is particularly true for the domestic households. Even if there is an increase in the tariff rate, if the total amount of money to be paid is the same, or even if there is a reduction, then we can put up the tariff rates. I think the administration would like to promote nuclear power that can lower the emission. But for nuclear power, I think we understand that it is going to harm the environment in an irrevocable manner. So please consider RE, renewable energy, rather than other types like nuclear power. Mr. Lai. Energy conservation. In fact, all along we've been working together with the EMSD in promoting the idea. And for our conservation fund, we have helped many housing estates and public facilities to use energy-saving light bulbs and other devices so as to save energy. Such promotional work will continue. Madam Chair, just now you also mentioned the supply of liquefied natural gas and whether we can diversify the source of supply. I'm sorry, the three of us are all from the EPD responsible for air policy. So for the overall energy policy or the electricity supply policy, I'm afraid I can only refer the questions to the Environment Bureau, where they will look at the question of energy policy. I think for layperson, if we try to source our natural gas from different sources, we may have to build more infrastructural facilities, and it may have an impact on the tariff one way or other. But I don't actually have the figures with me. Please give us a written reply as a supplement ASAP. If the information can satisfy us, then at least for myself, I will consider whether there is a need to set up a subcommittee upon Gazetto of the TM. Next, Mr. Wu Chi-wai, for the second time. The quick one, paragraph 11 talks about renewable energy, but I think we haven't got a lot of details. Have you talked to the power plants as to the concrete measures involved? That is how RE is to be developed and promoted. And are you going to provide incentives or support measures for the power companies so that they will be more interested in promoting RE? And then, on the face of it, it seems that the fuel mix will restrict the use of fuels. Usually we have natural gas, coal, and also nuclear power. Mr. Lai has said that we are also using low sulfur coal. Now, the APCO will mainly be looking at the emission of sulfur dioxide. I just wonder if the two power companies can use more low sulfur coal so as to meet the requirements, or rather as a result of the fuel mix restrictions, even if they can get good quality coal, they can't make use of more coal as the fuel. And then another question is, your emission caps are such that you draw up the requirements on the basis of the status quo. (2019) will be 5 or 6 years away, so I just wonder whether the emission control devices will become outdated, and there may be depreciation that has to be given so that the emission caps won't be or can be reasonable. Mr. Lai, for the fuel mix policy, a few years ago we started to talk to the power plants to see whether it is feasible to have solar energy or wind power among other REs. But then Hong Kong is a small place with a huge population. If we are to make use of solar energy or wind power on a larger scale, probably, technically, it will become a major challenge. And then a second point is that for RE, if you support our proposal to build the integrated waste management facility in Shek Kwu Chau, then we can have a higher proportion of fuel from RE. For the low sulfur coal, in a moment, Mr. Mok will also comment on the restrictions involved. As to the emission control technology, as long as we can give sufficient notice, that is 4 years, to the power plants, then we can ask them to make use of the best practicable means. But of course, there's also a real issue here. The emission control devices may become aged, and we're asking the power plants to maintain the emission levels, the emission control levels at a high level. So we're not going to relax on our requirements. Any other supplementary questions? If not, then we can wind up the discussion of this item, and I hope that the administration will gazette the TM ASAP. And if you can provide the written information to us well in advance, then there will be more information to enable us to consider whether we want to set up a subcommittee. I will be the chair lady for the panel for 2 years, and then on the 8th of October, when we start a new legislative year, there will be the election of a new chair. For the past 2 years, I'm grateful to you for your support. We paid site visits to look at the waste treatment plants, and it has taken our work forward hugely. I would like to thank you once again for your support for the work of the panel. Thank you. Madam Chair, before you wind up the discussion, can you not ask Mr. Mok to talk about the question of coal?
Well, I did ask whether members had follow-up questions. Why didn't you ask? Well, because he hasn't answered all my questions, so I thought, if your mobile phones are engaged in misconduct, I will drive your mobile phones out and members may stay. Mr. Mok, the TM doesn't regulate the fuel mix. Rather, it specifies the emission caps, and there is room for power companies to find other ways to meet the caps. There is nothing in this world that can be perfect. There is none. those are so-called low sulfur coal has a lower combustion value. In other words, the energy generation efficiency is also low. So if power companies use this kind of fuel, they have to activate more generation units. And the problem is this kind of coal can coagulate, and that can cause trouble to generation units. So power companies have their own considerations in using such coal. However, the TM doesn't dictate how power companies should manage their generation units. Do you have any follow-up? No more. I'm sorry. I apologize. Okay. The panel tries to be as open as possible, and it's okay from time to time for us to be lighthearted. Thank you very much for staying to the last minute amidst so many things happening. Thank you for allowing us to have this meeting so smoothly. Thank you very much.